Hi, my name is Borys, and in this video I'm going to show you 10 issues to check for before finishing your track. You can use this video as a checklist for every time you're doing the final export to make sure your track is ready to be published. Before we get into the video, if you like what we are doing on this channel, make sure to subscribe. We've got more content about Ableton coming up. If you'd like to learn Ableton 12 with all the foundations of music production, check out our Beginner to Advanced Live 12 Start to Finish course, and make sure to also check out the Everything Bundle Collector's Edition, which includes all of the courses, sound packs and project files in our store. And to see all of that, check the links in the video description. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so I have loaded up here a melodic house project file called Hewlett. Let's just give it a quick listen. Just let it go. Alright, so first of all, let's go onto the master chain. As you can see, this track is fully mastered here. So the first thing at this stage for me would be to check if we are still fully mono compatible. And that's pretty easy to check for. We just take a blank utility, we drop it onto the master and we click mono. We have to sort of A/B this a bunch of times and really listen to the white elements and make sure these do not disappear in mono. So let's check. Alright, so the most important thing, of course, would be the kick drum. We cannot have stereo issues with the kick drum, otherwise it's just going to sound really terrible in any concert/club setting. And the kick and the bass, it all needs to work. We can solo this even and A/B the mono compatibility. We have some stereo enhancement on the bass, but it's still definitely strong, no phasing in mono, so that's good. Another thing, of course, is the lead. Let's solo the lead sound. And once again, we have it quite strong in mono. Maybe we can now listen to the drum elements, the top loops, make sure this still stays. Yeah, so even though it's quite stereo, it's still fine. But one thing I noticed is that the pads are significantly quieter in mono. So that's our stereo signal. Maybe we can even take a listen to this one where we have more of these tracks. And let's mono. Alright, so I feel like, especially this top line, I don't know which track this is, but I think it's this one. We kind of lose it when we go mono. I hope you can hear that this is now really barely audible. If we take a look at the gain of the master before, it really significantly reduces here when we switch to mono. Of course, when you have issues like these, and this is really minor, it's not going to be very noticeable in mono, and especially that these are pads, these are typically very wide, so I think it's fine as it is. But if you want it to be 100% mono compatible, you would have to just use some stereo imaging tools on any tracks that disappear or kind of phase out when you sum up the track to mono. Alright, another thing, of course, we have to check for the EQ balance, but it's not enough to just throw in on an EQ8, listen and judge maybe we need more highs, we need more lows. I don't think it's that easy. And the only way to reliably do this is to import a reference track, in my opinion, and try to match your EQ curve of the track to that reference. So maybe we can load up a reference track here. All right, so we have another melodic house track over here, and let's just, maybe I'm even going to unwarp it. It's not necessary for this purpose. And I'm just going to enable our track. Let's give this one a listen. I am just going to disable the master chain on this one because it's obviously already been mastered. And so what's nice about working with reference tracks is that we can simply cut out the drop section, and maybe we will compare this to this part starting here, or perhaps even the start of the drop. And then we can also assign a key macro to our on-off switch of the master chain and to the on-off switch of this reference track and to the solo button of the reference track. So what happens now is we can either listen to our track mastered, or when we press our key macro, which I assigned to L, we just switch to the new reference track. So let's listen closely, especially let's just pay attention to the low end. So perhaps we could use actually a different reference track because we have completely different types of bass. So here we have a long sustained bass, here we have a groovy syncopated pattern, and it could be a bit harder to judge because typically you can have a sustained bass sound a bit quieter than something like we have going on here. But also perhaps we can take a listen to some of the hi-hats in this reference track and try to match our hi-hats to this one. This track has already been mastered, it's quite well mixed, so we don't have any major issues here. But what you could do also is just skip our master chain and maybe take an EQ 8 and just focus your attention on, for example, the highs. So cutting at 3 kHz and listening in. And switching to our reference. And you can do the same thing with isolating the low end, checking for vocals, how these sound if we kind of isolate the mids and highs. And yeah, that's another technique. Checking for the EQ balance, really important before you actually export your track. All right, another thing is dynamics between sections. So here you can see in our reference we have quite a lot of dynamics. So over here in this section we are really quiet at -11 dB, peaking maximum at -7. Let's take a look at our track here. So we could even check for just our instruments. And you can see we're also peaking at around -6. I think we have enough dynamics in the track. We're not squashing it so much with the compressor. And of course, we've got some drums also going on in this section, so the actual peak is going to be a bit louder. Yeah, but the instruments are nicely quieter, especially when compared to, for example, this section. But let's say you have not enough dynamics. You notice that all of the tracks are a bit squashed and you kind of want to give the listener a bit more breathing room. A cool thing is just throwing a utility onto the master track before the mastering chain and just automating the gain. So you could, of course, have your gain. And that's also what we did over here. The only difference being that we're automating the gain at the end of our track, which effectively just reduces also the ceiling because we have obviously the two limiters going on towards the end. So you just can take a look at, for instance, the break section, try to manage the gain here. And what we're doing here is just raising our gain by 2 dB when the drop hits for a bit more impact. So we can listen to this track without this utility. And now let's enable it. Yeah, so especially here in this very busy section, in this build-up, we're just reducing the gain slightly to give the kick drum here a nice boost. It's just 2 dB, it's barely audible. You don't really notice it, but you kind of can feel the higher ceiling when we hit the drop. So that's just one technique of dealing with this. Obviously, you can also tweak the makeup gain of the glue compressor. You can also tweak compressor settings throughout the track, and you could even boost certain frequencies with an EQ in certain sections if you feel like that's necessary. All right, the other thing I wanted to mention is, of course, the loudness level of your track. And there's a difference between the peak volume, which you can see over here, and the loudness, which basically is not measured in decibels, but in LUFS, so in loudness units. And there's a really simple, great plugin you can use to measure this. It's not yet available in Ableton stock effects, and it's called the Ulin loudness meter. If we just drop it onto the master and we listen to the drop, you're gonna see the LUFS value. Alright, so as you can see, we are around -10 LUFS. So I think that's a good starting point. If you boost the limiters a bit more, you're gonna get less. So we are getting -6, but already with significant distortion. And yeah, I think this is a really simple way to check. On our website, we have some nice tables and infographics regarding the desired LUFS levels for different streaming services. You might just want to make different versions with different loudness for different streaming services. And that's just because the streaming services just normalize the gain very often, which can result in your track sounding quieter or a bit squashed depending on the settings of the streaming services. Another thing that I won't be able to mention over here, but that you can easily check for yourself, is to take your track and actually listen to it on a poor sound system. So the easiest thing to do is just to take your phone, export the track onto the phone and listen to the phone speaker, because so often this is overlooked, especially when you have a great sound system at home. You might think nobody is really going to listen to your track in this setting, but you would be surprised at how often this matters and how often your track is going to be judged just based on the output of some really cheap speaker. So listen to how your elements translate to a really poor speaker. You can just buy a cheap portable speaker, or you probably have like a phone or anything else. Just listen to your track, especially to the lower end on these systems, because it tends to get lost, especially on really small speakers. So like a phone is definitely not going to have enough bass, and if your track relies heavily on the bass frequencies, well, it might just not translate completely. So you might have to adjust the equalization or the saturation of the track to make sure it's still listenable, at least in that setting. What you also need to check for is what your track sounds like when exported to MP3. And that's because most of the streaming services are actually going to use different quality settings that sometimes resemble the MP3 codec, it's really easy to check for. So when you export your track, you just need to select encode MP3, and it's just going to throw in an MP3 version alongside your WAV file. And I would advise you to listen especially to the highs and make sure these don't get phasey sounding. And if you want to combat that, either use different EQ settings or try and lower the ceiling level of the limiters, because MP3 for some reason tends to do a little bit of clipping when you have a really loud track. So check for MP3 compatibility, because very often your track just might be listened to not in like a FLAC or WAV file, but with a plain MP3. Now, another issue that's really common is that the kick drum is not going to come through really punchy towards the end of the processing. You have so many effects that it's just losing its punch. For that, I would advise you to first of all go back to the mixing stage, listen into the kick and bass on their own, and try to, instead of doing advanced equalization and trying to make enough room for the kick drum, use simple sidechain compression, or even better, use things like Shaper, LFO tool that allow you to manually adjust the curve of sidechain. So in this case, here's our kick and bass group. And on the bass line, we have different sidechain compressor settings on each of the layers. So if we just disable the kick, I think you hear that when the kick hits, obviously the bass line gets much quieter. And that's completely on purpose. If we were to disable these sidechain compressors, it just wouldn't sound nearly as clear. So the kick drum just loses its punch because we have clashing bass frequencies. So that's really important to check for. And if you do that correctly, the kick is just going to come through every time. And just try not to overdo it as well, because then you'll just lose the bass completely whenever the kick hits, of course. Another issue that's really common and that I would advise you to check for is, especially if you're struggling to get a nice LUFS level towards the end without significant distortion on the limiter, is to go back to the groups or even to individual tracks, especially to the drum tracks, and try to use limiters there already. So if you have a kick drum, or if you have some crispy, transient, heavy hi-hats, for example, that stick out, it's much better to deal with those sharp transients on the tracks themselves or on groups, buses, you name it, before actually dealing with the transients on the master track. That's just because limiters typically can only deal with so much gain before they start to introduce distortion. So if you use plenty of limiters or compressors before you reach the master stage, then you ensure that you will just need minor limiting towards the end. Or you could even do a trick like we did over here, just stacking 2 limiters at the end. That's also a nice solution if you're using limiters that don't sound clear after some point. And that's just to ensure that you can reach the nice loudness level without sacrificing your gain and still sound quite transparent. Also, a nice check is to ensure you are using panning or enough stereo enhancement, because panning is quite often overlooked. In this day and age, you have so many fancy effects that often your tracks will already be quite wide without having to use panning. But if you forgot to pan any of your instruments, towards the end there might be some space for that, especially if you're using plenty of drum tracks. In this case, if we have multiple hats, for instance, we could pan this one to the left. We've already done that. we might want to pan this one to the right, or if we have another HUD over here, we can pan this one to the left, this one to the right, and you can listen to what these sound like. And in this way, we are just creating stereo interest out of thin air pretty much. More often than not, your track is going to be listened to in stereo, so make sure to grab the listener's attention and use at least some drum elements with at least slight panning. And then the last tip I want to give you is to check whether you are actually using any bus processing. And that's quite crucial. I'm just going to enable the return tracks over here. In this case, we have plenty of return tracks from A to G, so we can just solo these. So as you can see, we've got reverbs. We have another reverb over here used for the drums. We have a rear bus, which is just doing some additional compression. We have a delay and yet another reverb over here. So if we were to disable these, we still have some effects on the tracks themselves, but these just make your effects and your instruments sound much more coherent. So using a few less reverbs and delays and just doing that processing on return tracks can be really, really beneficial, and you can precisely dial in the amounts of these sends just with these knobs over here or the controls on each of the tracks over here. Alright, I hope you found some of these tips useful. Make sure to check out our Music Production Academy with lots of start to finish courses on making tracks in various genres. And if you'd like to learn Ableton 12 with all the foundations of music production, check out the Beginner to Advanced Live 12 Start to Finish course. Make sure to also check out the Everything Bundle Collector's Edition, which includes all of the courses, sound packs and project files in our store. And to see all of that, check the links in the video description. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, leave it a like, write us a comment, and I will see you in the next ones.